Right, welcome back everybody. It's 1:30 and the inquiry is resumed.
Yeah. If you're still there, yeah.
Could we speak, sir, briefly?
Just one moment. Yes, I'll just check that everybody's with us. Mr. Banner, are you with us? I can't see you on my screen at the moment.
Yeah, he's there.
Yes. Right, okay, good. Thank you. Right, yes, so you wanted to say something, Councillor?
Yes, is there any point in us staying in the meeting? Do you want us for anything particular, or is it, could we duck out?
No, if you've said everything that you wanted to say, and that's fine if you want to leave at this point. So it's entirely up to you whether you stay or go. And obviously there's the live stream if you just want to observe at any point.
Yes, that's what we'll do. Okay, well, thank you very much for that.
We don't feel we can contribute a lot more to this discussion because we don't have the knowledge. So
yes, fair enough. Okay, well, thank you for coming.
And thank you very much for your time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Right, okay, just a few updates then, please, before we get started on housing land supply. The council was going to check about its position in relation to affordable housing and a couple of sentences in Ms Greengrass's proof. So could you just update me on the outcome of that, please, Mr Smythe?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the time. The council's reflected upon it and is prepared to give some grounds. So you'll recall that it's page 21 of Miss Greengrass's evidence, which causes some controversy. In respect of paragraph 7.6, I think the council's partly at fault for perhaps not expressing the proof as clearly as possible, and the appellant is perhaps reading more into it than it should do. The final sentence says that the affordable housing needs will be being met. The council accepts that it will not be fully met. So in other words, if all the allocations are built out tomorrow, there will still be an outstanding need for affordable housing. So the allocations make a significant contribution, they close the gap, but don't fully meet the need. So that being clear, sir, I'm happy to abandon that sentence and I would invite you to draw a line through it.
Okay, so that's the final sentence of paragraph 7.6.
Yes, it is. And then finally, in respect to 7.9, having read that with care, it seems to me it's a planning judgment and it's an argument about whether one attaches the adjective acute to the recognised shortfall. For reasons I won't go into, that's not an adjective the council adopts. To give you a preview of Miss Greengrass's evidence, she will use the adjective significant to describe the affordable housing shortfall, not acute. But ultimately, so I'm not sure it really helps you what adjective you attach. Either way, it's recognised it's not a modest shortfall. It's a significant shortfall which attaches weight in the appellant's favour. Unless I can assist you further.
May I just come back briefly on that, sir, just again, in the spirit of trying to be constructive. I mean, I'm grateful that the last sentence, 7.7, has been withdrawn. I think 7.9, certainly some of what's said in 7.9, I think it's fair to say is planning judgment and can be debated by the planners and ultimately put forward by submissions. There is a section, though, however, halfway through that I think probably does fall with the end of with the falling of 7.6, namely where it says, nor would the council agree that meeting affordable housing needs aren't being delivered through the plan-led system. That seems to be reiterating the abandoned point at 7.6. I think if the council could agree that that's struck out, I would accept that everything else is planning judgment. I still wouldn't need to call Mr. Stacey, but I think that middle bit does fall in the same category as the bit which has been withdrawn.
Yeah, I agree, sir. I'm happy to draw a line through that. So from nor until system.
Okay. I think on that basis, so I'm grateful for that. I think on that basis, honestly, whilst we don't agree with the rest of 7.9, I think then I'm prepared to accept that doesn't necessitate me calling Mr. Stacey. Obviously, his evidence still stands and it's unchallenged, and I'll be making submissions on that basis. But I don't see the need for you to hear from him orally, unless you see a need, sir.
No, thank you very much for that. So yes, as previously pointed out, the council is not taking an issue. I don't have any questions on that topic. And interested parties have also indicated that they don't intend to ask any questions. So I think that the affordable housing evidence can be taken as written evidence as well.
Well, Mr. Stacey's listening, so by this I'll stand him down and I will draw attention to what I need to in closing. Thank you, sir.
Right, thank you. Okay, right, good. And then the Section 106 agreement, conditions and seal compliance statement, has there been any progress on that?
I've seen some emails, sir. You'll get something today, I think, is the latest. I think it's probably better if I say no more than that now, but it's in progress and we'll update you before the end of the proceedings today.
Yes, right, good, thank you. And then finally, just a point on the revised position statement for housing land supply that was submitted this morning. I've had a look over that during the adjournment, and it's not exactly what I asked for, in that it doesn't break the sites down into the different categories from the framework, and some of the sites don't seem to have been updated at all. The council still seems to suggest that the appellant's position is unknown, which is clearly not the case. So we're going to have to work our way through the sites individually. The other thing that's missing is any recalculation of the 5-year housing land supply position as a result of the concessions that have been made. I will ask for that, but perhaps after we've had the roundtable session, that there may have been more concessions or changes that need to be taken into account. There has been some agreement, so thank you for that agreement which has been reached. It's narrowed the number of sites slightly. So anyway, I have that document and we'll use that as the basis for the roundtable session. Are there any other matters that anyone wants to raise before we get into that?
So other than to just indicate, I'm on this camera, but I'm going to be off screen just to give Mr. Austin a bit more space, but I'm on this particular screen, so if I need to chip in, I'll swing around on my swivel chair.
Okay, that's fine, thank you. Just one final thing from me before we move on to housing land supply. Is Ms. Carbello on the line still? I think she is on the list. Are you there?
I am.
Yes, good, thank you. You indicated this morning that you were here to answer any questions about education contributions. So I should have said this morning, but I'll say it now. We'll be having a discussion about planning obligations, as I indicated, later in the inquiry process. That's likely to be towards the end after I've heard evidence. So it's entirely up to you whether you want to stay or go, but that's probably the point at which we will be discussing education contributions. The council is putting together a seal compliance statement, so I would hope you're in contact with the council anyway, and giving some contribution and justification for education contributions that will be fed into that document. So if I could just invite you to have those discussions with the council, and just to let you know really that we won't be coming on to talk about that for some time.
All right, thank you very much. I will contact them.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, good. Well, let's get started then with the roundtable session dealing with housing land supply. Mr. Austin Fell, you're going to be talking for the appellant. And Mr. Kay has just appeared for the council. Good.
Afternoon.
Afternoon. Okay, I've got a few sort of overarching points of principle that I want to go through first. I did receive the draft agenda, sorry, from Mr. Austin Fell, but that covers a lot of ground which I think is already agreed in a lot of cases. So I want to focus on my questions in relation to housing land supply. So we'll go through my questions and I'll give you both an opportunity to say anything further that you want to say when we come to the end. So I think there is agreement between the parties that the local plan is more than 5 years old, and so the standard method is the process that we need to use to establish the local housing need, and also that the appropriate base date is the 1st of April 21. So that's a good start. There's no disagreement on buffers or lapse rate as far as I have been able to establish. But there is a difference between the parties on applying the standard method, slight as it is, in that the council is seeking to recalculate now that we've reached 2022. So could I just ask Mr. Kay for you to explain why you've done that, please?
Yes, thank you, sir. If I take you to my proof, and at the same time, if you could bring up core document 5.3, which is the inspector decision by Inspector Searson of September 2020. I'll just give you a moment to pull that one up, and I'll be referring to paragraph 46 of that core document. So in simple terms, what I've done is, because we're now in January rather than December, so we've entered a new year, and following Inspector Searson's guidance at paragraph 46, where she says that the current year is 2020. In that particular appeal, what was happening was the council was suggesting that the current year was 2019, because that was the base date of the 5-year land supply at that time. However, that inspector disagreed, as you can see in that paragraph, and says that the current year is whatever the current year is of the decision. So that being 2020. Now we're in 2022, that we bring that forward so that that's the basis on which the calculations are made. So I'm purely following what Inspector Searson has done in my method. I appreciate the numbers are fairly small. I'm not 100% clear what the position of the appellant is. At 4.4 of Mr. Austin Fell's proof, the last sentence of paragraph 4.4, he does refer to, quote, as the appeal is being heard in January 2022, it is the expectation that the council will rely on this figure. But he makes no comment, as far as I can tell, why that is wrong, or that he himself is not actually using it. So to cut it short, I'm merely following the guidance set, or the precedent set by Inspector Searson, and I've got no evidence presented to me why that should not be the case for this appeal. Thank you.
Right, okay, so you're simply following the approach that Inspector Searson took?
Correct.
Yes, do you agree with that approach? That makes logical sense to you, does it?
I actually admit, I accept, it's not 100% clear cut in the guidance, and I will accept that at the appeal decision I've just referred to, which I sat at, my evidence in that one was that the current year would be the base date year of your 5-year land supply. So in this case, it would be 2021. However, I lost the argument in that appeal, as you can see from Inspector Searson, disagreed with me and said that the base date should be the year at which the decision is made. So I held my hands up. Obviously, that's the inspector's judgment. So I can see an argument either way, actually. But as an inspector very recently has made that call, I simply, in my evidence and my 5-year land supply report I published from thereafter, I've always followed Inspector Searson's guidance, and I've been given no evidence why she was wrong, and why I should revert back to my previous position. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Austin Fell, then perhaps you can explain what your position is.
Thank you, sir. And my position, helpfully, like Mr. Kay, is quite a simple one as well. We've had regard to Inspector Searson's decision, but we know that it isn't something that is binding in totality. It's, as Mr. Kay has pointed out, an area where there is some grey or uncertainty in the PPG, and it's for a decision taker to come to a view about what should be done here. Our view is quite simple. Our view is that the the use of the base date from 2021 is appropriate for two reasons. First and foremost, that it aligns with the council's supply, which starts in April of that year. And secondly, it reflects the date at which the 5-year land supply report was published. So there's a strong degree of commonality and consistency in ensuring that the two are aligned and dovetailed. As Mr. Kay points out, there isn't a great deal of difference between the two figures. We're only really talking about a change in the household projections as the starting point, but I think it's still right in principle to establish it from the outset, and that accounts for our use of the 21 household projection to understand that 10-year average.
Good. So, okay, thank you. Well, that was my understanding of the appellant's case, that that it was being suggested that the base date year should be the year for the calculation. Mr. Kay, you seem unaware of that. So having heard what you just heard and based upon what you just said, what do you think is the correct approach?
I don't dispute what Inspector Searson's conclusion is. I'm simply following what Inspector Searson has done. I see no error in what she did, and therefore, if for this decision or any other decision, an alternative view is taken, I would expect some kind of evidence put forward as to why Inspector Searson didn't correctly apply what was expected of national policy. I can't see that at all in the proof of the appellant here. There's no comment at all on Inspector Searson and why she got it wrong, to put it simply. My understanding was that simply by using the numbers in the table at, I think it's table 11.1 of the appellant's proof on page 51, that that the appellant is using the 2021 base date. It's just simply that in the text of the whole proof, there is no commentary to explain why that they are going for that number and explaining any evidence why Inspector Searson is wrong. So that's simply where my confusion, it's only minor confusion, but I still believe that my position, as I say, following is reasonable, following the Inspector Searson decision. And we're just one final comment. We do talk about it being a relatively minor difference. It is a difference of 21, but when, as we now are only short by 30 units to get to a 5-year land supply, that's actually this actually is 60 odd percent of reaching that threshold of whether we're or not we've got a 5-year land supply. So it is actually quite a significant point.
Right, okay. You just heard what Mr. Austin Fellas had to say, that it makes sense for there to be alignment between the base date and the local housing need figure being used. So I'm struggling to understand. I can hear the appellant's position and the reason why it thinks that that's the correct approach. And all I'm hearing from you is that you're following the previous appeal decision. So why are you saying that should be used rather than aligning the two dates?
Well, my understanding is that where an inspector very recently has made a decision which could be applied to other decisions elsewhere, a sort of a precedent set, that the decision maker should follow that precedent unless there's clear evidence why not. I'm not seeing any clear evidence why not, and therefore I'm simply following the evidence that the decision that Inspector Searson reached. I accept, as I accept at the start, there is a case you could argue. If Inspector Searson's decision wasn't there, I can quite clearly see an argument that you could commence from the 2021 base date, and the current year is 2021. However, that relies on me ignoring or essentially objecting to Inspector Searson's decision, which is not something I have any evidence to do, and therefore I'm simply following Inspector Searson's guidance on that point.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Austin-Fell, could you finally just tell me why I should take a contrary position to the inspector in the previous case?
Yes, sir. And the appeal exists. It does not bind you to follow exactly what Inspector Searson has set out in her approach last year. As I've mentioned previously, there is a commonality to ensure that the data you're using is consistent on all fronts. To use the 2021 base date is inherently sensible to me because that aligns with the supply. You're looking at the two together rather than a moving position whereby you might find the council supply, if it wasn't updated, continues to be in April 21, and you're continuing to update the housing requirement on the back of that. Hopefully we won't be in that situation in the future, but in every iteration of the supply calculation, it would be prudent to do it in this way. That's what I'd be recommending, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Kay, sorry, could you just refer me to the paragraph of the appeal decision that you're relying on?
Yes, certainly, sir. It's paragraph 46.
So in that case, the appellant was the one arguing what you're arguing now, and the council was content to accept it. Is that right, Mr. Kay?
Yeah, at that appeal, I was actually arguing in the same way that the appellant in this appeal is arguing, but as that inspector, I basically lost the argument on that point at that appeal. From that date onwards, and all future reports I've published or appeals I may have attended or helped with decisions, I've always pointed to the fact that Inspector Searson made this decision, and therefore we should follow that decision from there on in. And that's simply been my position since Inspector Searson's decision.
Okay, so your professional view has changed as a result of that decision?
As a result of that decision, my professional views changed, correct.
Right, okay, thank you. Okay, fine, let's move on then, please. Are there any other matters in terms of applying the standard method where there's disagreement between the parties? It doesn't seem to me that there is. No. Okay, good. Okay, a point of principle then. The appellant is suggesting that only sites that were deliverable at the base date should be included in the list of supply sites. So could I just ask you, Mr. Ostenfeld, to just explain that to me?
Thank you, sir. The approach that I've set out, which is something outlined in my proof, is one about when it is right to include materials relevant to the council supply position. And what we've set out, and I'll take you, sir, if you don't mind, in my proof to, sorry, bear with me, sir, it's sections 6.7 and 6.10 in particular. I think it's quite helpful. Because what we can see here, sir, is a bit of a chronology of recent decisions, some of which involving the Secretary of State, which ask us to come to a view on the council supply, both at the time of the base date, but also taking a view on what has happened since that time. Now, what we say, sir, is it's wholly appropriate to account for evidence on sites where permission has been granted beforehand, in the case of an outline or a detailed application, and where evidence of further continuation of progress, i.e. a site where it moves from outline, say, to its reserved matters, where that happens beyond the base date, so we say that that evidence can be accounted for, albeit you need to critically analyse whether or not it is a factor relevant to deliverability. What the council should not be doing is accounting for any new sites that have occurred since the base date of the 1st of April, and that is a principle we've applied consistently. What the council appeared to be saying on a number of fronts is, well, we have detailed applications that have come in since the base date, and absolutely we want to rely on those. But what we don't want to do is account for sites where they've lapsed beyond the base date. And that, sir, in my mind, is a bit of a kind of have your cake and eat it situation where they want to regard one form of evidence and not the other. Our approach, sir, is that we've tried to be fair and reasonable in looking at the supply where furtherment of existing schemes have been presented, but we also have to be very clinical and look at those sites which are clearly not going to come forward, i.e. those where the 2 or 3 year life of the permission has come to an end up until the exchange of proofs, and that is what we've done, sir. So as I said, I'm happy to sort of walk through the different sites that we've got in the schedule. If the council wants to present their own view on each of those, that is acceptable way of doing things. Or if you want to sort of look at it in the round again, so we're happy to do that.
Well, we're going to look at each individual site in due course, but I just want to sort of address this point of principle up front. So I'll ask Mr. Kay to tell me, please, if you disagree with anything that's been said there.
I think there's very little between us on this point. Perhaps the simplest way for me to explain how the council approaches this is if I could turn you to core document 5.46, which is a Secretary of State decision on Woburn Sands. I'll give you a moment to find that one. And it's paragraph 12. The second sentence of that one is basically how I approach it. So it says, for the reasons given at the inspector's report 12.8 to 12.12, the Secretary of State agrees with the inspector that it is acceptable that the evidence can post-date the base date, provided that it is used to support sites identified as deliverable as of 1st of April 2019, that being the base date for that particular appeal. So that's how I approach it, that if a site was deliverable as at 1st of April 2021, in my case, then it can go into the 5-year land supply, and that evidence post that base date can also be used to support that after that base date. What I don't do, or my approach to the sites, are that I don't include a site which, as at 1st of April 2021, in my case, if we could all jump back to that date, that there was no realistic prospect of that site coming forward, but that something has happened since that base date to make it a realistic prospect. I don't do that. That's not my approach into 5-year land supply. It has to have had some reasonable prospect in accordance with the MPPF definition of deliverability as at the base date. I accept that I do then go on to use post base date evidence to help support that point in certain circumstances. But that, as the Secretary of State's confirmed, is an acceptable approach. So I think there's very, very little between us. If there happens to be a site or two where this is then a specific comment that we can debate whether I've applied that sentence accurately or not, then I'm very happy to do so. But I don't think it's a common theme or error on my part throughout all of this land supply at all. Thank you.
Yes, okay, thank you. Well, based on that, I'm not sure there's anything between you at all on the point of principle, but anything that either of you want to say on that, so we'll obviously have a look at individual sites with that in mind. Okay. Thank you. One of the things that the appellant is pointing out is that in some circumstances it suggests the council's revisited its assessment based upon evidence post base date. But has the council sought to carry out that same reassessment and discounted sites that now appear not to be deliverable?
In the majority of instances, what was deliverable at the base date, we've stuck to that position. If there's clearly some evidence brought to our attention which makes that site evidently undeliverable, then yes, we would have flagged that up and we wouldn't have included it in the 5-year land supply. Now, what we don't do, for example, particularly on minor sites, where, as at the base date, permission is still extant. So, on 1st of April, it would be listed as not under construction, for example, or not started, for example. We don't go out on the very day that application may potentially have lapsed and have a look to see if it has actually lapsed. That is something we pick up on an annual basis. It's simply not pragmatic. We have literally hundreds and hundreds of sites that we would have to be going around almost on a daily basis trying to check. Well, we don't do that. That's a matter for the annual update to do. So that's where we don't do it. But if there's some other significant evidence that we're made aware of, then yes, we would take that into account and potentially remove a site from the supply before we publish the annual 5-year land supply report.
Mr. Austin-Fell, anything you want to say on that?
Thank you, sir. I think in general terms, the approach is not unreasonable. You have to sort of look at what evidence is available to you at a particular time. I think in the case of East Cambridgeshire, they have the benefit, and I've seen this benefit. They've got a very comprehensive monitoring system. That monitoring system they've kindly shared with me, and that's the data I've used to interrogate their supply. That system has categories whereby they specify whether sites have lapsed. It has categories to indicate whether sites are not started or have commenced. And so I can see behind the scenes there is a level of complexity going on, albeit I must say that I don't understand in entirety when each site has been updated. But what I can see is the capacity or the ability for the council to record accurately the status of their supply, and that's something that they should have done at the time for publishing their report. We have made some progress on that front, I should say, where either council have accepted it, some sites should be removed because they have indeed lapsed, or I have been corrected. And I stand to have been corrected because the records perhaps that I was provided at the time weren't up to date and have now been updated. So as part of this iterative sort of process of looking at the schemes, I think it's been somewhat helpful in that context.
Right, okay, thank you. And I think from your previous answer, Mr. Kay, you were saying that the council hasn't sought to add new sites into the deliverable category post-base dates that weren't already included. You've just used more up-to-date information to support the previous inclusion, is that right?
Yes, as a matter of principle, that's correct. Yes.
Mr. Austin-Fell, are you generally in agreement that that's what's been done?
There are instances, sir, where the council's evidence has referred to a number of schemes, schemes that have been included at the base date, but have either lapsed or are considered to be undeliverable. But there have been applications submitted or approved, say, after the base date, which the council have sought to link to that previous entry. So there are instances, sir, and I hope we can go through them, where we say that these new entries to the supply have been captured erroneously and should be included within the 2022 supply update onwards.
Right, okay, thank you. We'll come on to look at those individual sites. All right, so I just want to touch on the windfall allowance. The council is, again, I think, following a previous appeal decision and is seeking to include 50 units for years 3, 4 and 5 of the supply. The appellant is suggesting that that's unlikely and seeks to remove 50 units from year 3. So firstly, if I ask the council please to just explain why it's thought that these 150 units will be delivered and the basis for including them, please.
Yes, thank you, sir. The obvious place to take you to is the 5-year land supply report, which is core document 3.24. So that's our 5-year land supply report, the one that we publish normally once a year. This one published in autumn and forms the basis of this discussion this afternoon. Appendix B within that report, so that's page I think it's 71 of the report. Appendix B is windfall justification. So there's several pages there setting out our evidence to justify why an allowance of 50 units is given. So there's several pages there of evidence. Our approach to this and the allowance of 50 per year is something we've maintained for several years. So if you went back through several years worth of our 5-year land supply reports, you would see pretty much the same tables and same evidence and the same approach and the same number churned out at the end of an allowance of 50 per year for the last 3 years. So it's a consistent approach we've taken. Obviously, the only updates being that each year we update the table on the 3rd page of Appendix B, which just updates the numbers in terms of each year, in terms of what the small scale supply has been in that past year. So our evidence, as Mr. Smythe said in his opening, it has been tested recently in the appeals. Very similar comments were made by the appellant at the time, saying that the evidence wasn't compelling, and that being the test in the MPPF, that it needs to be compelling evidence. The appellant in this case is not suggesting that it should be set at naught, that we don't have any evidence. So obviously they're accepting we do have some compelling evidence because they're accepting a 100 units. So there's common ground that we do have compelling evidence for a windfall allowance in principle. The disagreement is in what year that should start. We say year 3, 4, 5. So we've discounted years 1 and 2. The appellant has discounted a further year. I disagree with that. Discounting the first couple of years is sensible because that allows these small sites that may have got permission in the last year or two they will get built out because they will be accounted for within the 5-year land supply already. So we would be in danger of double counting if we started to have an allowance of 50 in the first couple of years. But beyond year 3 onwards, we think it's perfectly reasonable. And as I said, that was tested at a recent appeal. The inspectors confirmed that it was compelling evidence to have the 150 within the 5-year period, and we've seen no evidence to suggest that decision was wrong of those inspectors, or that our evidence is not compelling to suggest that 150 is reasonable. So that's our approach. We've just maintained a position that we have for a long-standing position that has been tested at appeals, been found sound, been found compelling, and we see no reason why today that position should be altered. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. And Mr. Ostenfeld, could you just explain to me why you say that the 50 units from year 3 should not be included?
Yes, thank you, sir. I think the point that we make is, again, hopefully a simple one to you, and it's when that 50 dwelling per annum is applied. We've already been taken to Inspector Searson's decision from Winchford last year. What I would light on here, sir, is that whilst the inspector endorsed the use of the windfall rate, and we don't dispute that windfalls can't be included here, but whilst the inspector endorsed the use of that rate, the appellant in that context was questioning the use of the windfall rate in its entirety. And what the inspector hasn't done here, as Mr. Kay is suggesting, is endorse the use of the 50 per annum, which is the claim that we're making. My point, and I said it was a simple one, and it is, when we look at the council supply, particularly those derived from small sites, non-major sites, and I think that's a good indicator of windfall development. When we look at those, we can see that in the first 3 years, there's an aggregated total, I think, of about 277 per annum. You have 215 in year 1, a glut in year 2, 459, and 157 in year 3, tailing off. Nothing in years 4 and 5. So we're coming back, sir, to the point that Mr. Kay just mentioned about why it wasn't appropriate to use a windfall rate in those early years, because there would be risk of double counting. I agree with that sentiment, and that's something that I've applied in my assessment here, but not in years 1, 2, and 3, where we're seeing evidence of quite substantial delivery. So to include a windfall rate on years 3, 4, and 5 would, in my view, sir, be double counting. I've only included a windfall contribution in years 4 and 5 to account for that breakage when we start stopping to see windfall development. Just if I might say, just a broader point about windfall growth, because whilst I'm not sort of criticising the way the council have done it, it's important to note that the windfall assessment is a reflection of what we've seen in the past, as it only can be. We haven't got a quantification, I think, of what is coming forward in the future. But it's worth bearing in mind as well, sir, that there is only a sort of finite amount of windfall that we can potentially expect to see coming forward. There's been a lot of growth in this area in the last 17 years, as the council have evidenced. A lot of growth, but probably on small areas within settlement boundaries, brownfield land that can realistically be developed. But I do sort of query whether over the longer term period we're going to see the same rates that the councils have observed in the past, because quite simply that resource will start to dry up. So I think, sir, there's a strong case here to include a windfall rate, but as I say, that should only be in years 4 and 5.
Right, okay, thank you. Could you just touch on the previous appeal decision where it was found that years 3, 4, and 5 should have a 50 dwelling allowance? Is there some difference in the supply here in that appeal case, which would should lead me to a different conclusion?
As I said, so it's paragraphs 54 and 55 of Court Document 5.3. That's the Winchford appeal Mr. Kay refers to. And in this assessment, we can see that Inspector Searson is really only engaging with the principle of windfall development. She hasn't been invited to look at the annual contribution to be applied to windfall. So whilst I can understand why the council is relying on it, I don't think it is directly applicable.
Mr. Kay, do you agree with that the inspector didn't actually delve into that level of detail?
No, I don't agree with that. If you can look at if you have those 2 paragraphs that you've just been pointed to, 54 and 55. In 55, for example, she even makes reference to the point of double counting, or that the council's avoiding double counting with sites. So it's not just a matter of principle that she just says, yes, I agree, it can be included or not included. She goes into 2 paragraphs explaining her decision, pointing to things like she's looked at whether we're double counting or not and come to a judgment. So I disagree with that. She's looked at it thoroughly and has come to a conclusion that well, she concludes as quoting the last sentence of paragraph 55, I consider this to be a robust approach which meets the compelling evidence test. So she's clearly referencing the MPPF there. She's undertaking a test based on the MPPF wording and has come to that conclusion. I think that's more than just a cursory look at it and an acceptance of it in principle. She's done a thorough test. Okay, if I may pick up a separate point that Mr. Ostenfeld made, is now an appropriate time?
Yes, please.
He referred to just then that I'm sure he'll correct me if I'm misquoting here, but that windfall is a finite resource. We don't know what's going to happen in the future, et cetera, et cetera. Well, of course, we don't know what's going to happen in the future. But can I draw your attention back to the 5-year land supply report? So that's core document 3.24 again, and again, still in Appendix B. And if I take you to the table B1 in that appendix, that's the 3rd page of Appendix B. You can see some statistics there. And just looking at the last 3 years, So whilst we base our evidence over 16 or 17 years worth of monitoring this kind of data, so that's that emphasizes the compelling evidence bit. But if you just look at the last 3 years and the middle column, so the small scale development, i.e. windfall, so these are not allocated sites, you can see 128 3 years ago, 183 2 years ago, and 135 the previous year. So these are way above 50 that we're actually making an allowance for. It's what, a third on average, something like that. And as I said, we've already discounted the first 2 years. I don't think it would be reasonable, or I don't think the council's position is unreasonable, where we're suggesting that in future years, it'll only be 50, when the evidence here is pointing in the last 3 years evidence, despite what Mr. Austin-Fells just said, that, this is finite, it might still, implying that it might dry up to nothing. Well, the last 3 years, you can see the numbers there, 128, 183, and 135. They're significantly above even what we are applying. So I just wanted to come back on that point. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Okay. Mr. Austin-Fells, anything more you want to say on that before we move on?
No, I don't think I want to labour the point, sir, but only simply to say that, we're looking at the past, but we don't have a view yet on what's happening in the future. And that whilst I observe, the council's record of past delivery, it is a simple point that opportunities for windfalls will reduce in an area like East Cambridgeshire, where there are only a small number of urban conurbations. I'm not disputing the 50 dwellings per annum, so I'm not disputing the evidence that underpins that. As I mentioned before, it is only the years in which it should be applied to. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Right, can I just ask about the sites that have been included in the council's supply? Mr. Kay, is it your view that they all fall within the definition of deliverable from the framework and the part A and B of that definition?
Are you referring to the full list in my 5-year land supply, or just the disputed sites?
The disputed sites are the ones I'm interested in.
Yeah, so I would actually, I'd answer the same for the full report as well. I believe that they do all comply with the definition of deliverability as set out in the MPPF. To assist you, you made a point earlier that at the start of this afternoon's session about how they are categorized. Hopefully I can just explain to you here, because it may not be as complicated or as you may first assume. So in the 5-year land supply report itself, so in the core document 3.24, the appendices there are broken down into separate categories, starting with the sites, minor sites with consent. So that's obviously category A of the MPPF. Then the next set of sites are majors with full permission. So again, that's still category A, MPPF. And then the remaining sets of sites, so appendix A3 onwards, fall into category B of the MPPF. Your updated schedule you received this morning on the disputed sites is similarly broken down. It would have been helpful, I accept now, if we could have just put a subheading in, but if I could just very briefly talk you through how that's broken down. So the first page, or the first 2 pages, apart from the very last site on the second page, they're all minor with full permission, category A, MPPF. And then the last site on page 2, taking you through page 3, page 4, and the first row on page 5, they are all major with full, and therefore category A, MPPF definition. And then I believe, and Mr. Austin-Fells will correct me if I'm wrong here, thereafter, so the rest of page 5 onwards, a category B, I believe.
So which one is the first of the category Bs?
So that would be site, and so page 5 we're looking at site. If you look at the site reference, the first column is 20006, because that one, for example, is an outline permission. So that one doesn't yet have full.
Okay, and all of the following sites are all Cat B.
I believe that is the case, yes, because it's following the same pattern and in the same order as the my full 5-year land supply report. Yeah. Mr. Austin Feller, correct me if I've got any of that wrong, but I believe that that description was just accurate.
No, that's helpful, Mr. Kay. The only thing I'd add on to that is once we get to the rear of the schedule from page 12 onwards, that is when we start to get into category E sites, which are those allocated in the development plan.
Right, okay. I was referring to the definition in the framework, which has categories A and B, but you're talking about the further breakdown that's used by the parties, I think, category E.
Thank you, sir. If we are to produce an updated schedule for purposes of this appeal, we'll endeavour to do so in a way that aligns with the annex definitions.
Yes, okay, thank you. Well, that's helpful anyway, so thank you for that. Right, okay, thank you. Right, let's move on then to past housing shortfalls. The appellant provides evidence about past shortfalls against the local plan housing requirement and suggests that these should be taken into account in some way. Can you just talk me through that, Mr. Ostenfeld, in the context of the standard method?
I'd be happy to, sir. And I think the relevant place to start is perhaps table 5.1 of my proof. That's on page 13. That table, sir, is an aggregate of the council's performance since the plan period started in 2011. I'll just wait for you to get that.
Yes, table figure 5.1, was it?
Thank you, yes. And what we sought to do here is to look at the council's performance set against the plan figure, which was applied at a flat rate of 575 dwellings per annum, reflecting on those rates of delivery that have occurred derived from government sources of data. Most recently, those that were published on the 25th of November, which allow us to look at the monitoring year 2021. And
sorry to interrupt you. Just before you go into too much detail, I'm really in the first instance looking at why any of this is relevant in the context of the standard method.
Yes.
Given that the standard method doesn't require any additional alteration for past shortfalls.
Let me break it down into two parts, sir. Then, in the context of the standard method, we have a very clear position that one is to sort of look at the position from now going forward, where a plan is out of date, and in the context of that, both parties accept that the plan is now more than 5 years old. So we look at the standard method, which tells us not to account for any shortfalls. There's a number of debates rumouring on about oversupply, but I won't get into that right now. But in terms of that shortfall, it tells us to wipe the slate clean because, sir, the affordability adjustment of part of the standard method would be assumed to capture any shortfalls to date. Now, in clinical terms, I say that that shortfall cannot be accounted for in the 5-year calculation. But in planning terms, sir, it's very clear to me that that shortfall and the scale of that shortfall will not be captured, not only within the 5-year period, but a period much longer than As I pointed out in my proof, the shortfall is nearing 2,800 dwellings to date. That is not something that an uplift within the standard method is simply going to capture. So in my view, sir, it's a wider relevant consideration for this appeal in the context of the weight to be afforded to the housing supply generated by this appeal proposal. In a nutshell, I think that probably wraps it up, but welcome to explore the sort of numbers with you, sir.
Right, okay, thank you. Mr. Kay, if you could just tell me your position on the past shortfall evidence that's been presented.
I think it's very clear. National policy makes it clear that any shortfall is addressed via the standard method. We're applying the standard method, and therefore, for the purpose of discussion this afternoon on 5-year land supply, it's an irrelevant point because it is captured via the standard method. So I don't think there's anything further to add. And I think the statement of common ground, correct me if I'm wrong, actually agrees that point, that shortfall is not relevant to the calculations.
So perhaps if I could just come back on that, and I said, risk of, I hope, not duplicating what Mr. Osterfeld's already said. I think the question whether it's relevant, I think Mr. Kay is confusing two separate things. The shortfall is not relevant in the context of assessing what the 5-year supply is, the purposes of the framework, because the framework prescribes how that's done. But growth 1 and the requirement figure in that is still part of the development plan. And that development plan was based upon an objective assessment of housing needs. And that's still relevant in the context of planning balance. It's a relevant consideration, plainly a relevant consideration. It would couldn't possibly be said that it's completely irrelevant. And so it goes to weight in the event, or really irrespective of whether or not there is or isn't a 5-year supply, it goes to the weight to be given to the contribution this appeal scheme will make to housing delivery. The fact that there was historically a shortfall, that shortfall remains in relation to the housing local plan requirement, and it will increase and won't be met by the end of the plan period. So it's not relevant specifically to the context of 5-year supply, but it is relevant to the bigger, broader picture. That's how we put it, and that's how I consistent with how I put it in opening, I think.
Right, okay, thank you for that. So, Mr. Kay, anything you want to say in response to that?
I'm not, do not concede as a matter of principle that despite the housing requirement figure being acknowledged as out of date, and when we're using the standard method anyway, but even on the basis of that 11,500 figure in growth 1 within the period 2011 to 2031, I do not concede that there is no prospect of that being met. I accept that in the first 10 years or so of the plan period, taking as a straight average, that we didn't achieve that year on year as an average. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we cannot catch up over the remaining 8 to 9 years of the plan period. As I set out in the 5-year land supply report, there's over 10,000 homes identified. Now, with an incredibly fair wind, theoretically those 10,000 could be delivered on top of what's already been delivered, and that would exceed what is in the local plan. So it's not an impossible by far that the actual housing set in the local plan 2011 to 2031 could not be met. So I don't concede that point that there is a certainty that over the plan period that there will be a shortfall. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anything further, Mr. Ostenfeld?
Yes, thank you, sir. I mean, the point that is very important to remember here is that the council need more than a fair wind. Their ship has been on fire for the last few years. And that's quite evident in the rate of delivery that we've observed over the last few years. I introduced the housing supply background paper as part of my rebuttal. And if you'll indulge me, sir, very briefly, I'd just like to take you to that because I think it's relevant for these discussions. This was a document which was published for the purpose of understanding when the plan would deliver. when the sites within that plan, the allocations would come to fruition. And it's quite clear from this document. I'll just take you to a particular page. We're on page 34.
What's the core document reference, please?
Sorry, so this is the appendix 1 to my rebuttal, sir.
Yes, I need the reference for where I can find the rebuttals, because they don't seem to be where I expect them to be.
Problematic, but the document is so. Are we there, sir? Good.
Yes, sorry. So they've been added now, I think. So let me just bring that in.
Thank you. Page 30, sir, when you're ready.
Page 30 of the internal page numbers.
Sorry, page 30 of the appendix. So it's right at that back of that of the rebuttal document itself, sir.
Yes, is that housing trajectory, local plan estimate 11 to 31?
Thank you. And what I'd like to do, sir, is just quickly draw your attention to the council supply estimates. There were a number of these documents that were prepared for the local plan in advance of its submission and adoption in 2015. What I'd like to do is just take you quickly to that line at the bottom where we're looking at the housing trajectory totals. You know, it's quite clear that the council expected that when the plan was adopted in 2015, there would be a significant deluge of housing. You know, rates exceeding 1,000 for 3 years on the trot, rates far beyond they've been expected to deliver, going all the way up to, let's say, 2025, when it would slow down again. You know, it was very much dependent on allocations which we would have expected to have come to bear. Allocations which, as we'll see, you know, have either not delivered as expected or will not be delivering within the 5-year period at all. If I could just take you to one site in particular, so it's a few pages before, on page 25 of that document, the Eastern Gateway at Soham. That site is at the top of the list there. Is regarded for 600 dwellings. The council anticipated delivery from 2016-17 onwards. That site, sir, is now expected to deliver from 2026. So right at the end, or outside of the plan, the 5-year period. So we've seen very clear issues with the council in terms of bringing these allocations to the fore. That has led to that significant housing shortfall that I've identified. And as I've set out in my proof of evidence, sir, I do not consider that the council has the ability to meet that shortfall within the plan period. Be aware, sir, that in my proof of evidence, I've set out a trajectory whereby, as part of figure 5.2, I've used data which I have actually derived from the council themselves, the data I referred to before, that sort of sets out trajectory beyond the 5-year period. So by the council's own data set, by the end of the plan period in 2030-31, we'd expect to see a shortfall of 303 dwellings. So that is unvarnished data without my supply inferences to show that shortfall will not be met in the plan period. My own assessment, which is later on in my proof, suggests that that figure is indeed going to be far higher. And I accept that the council have a bank of permissions, Mr. Kay referred to, in and or around 10,000 dwellings. But as we can discuss, you know, the presence of an outline permission does not guarantee delivery. And I think that the council will be very hard pressed to eliminate that shortfall in the remaining period that they've got.
Right, okay, thank you. All right, I want to have a look then at build out rates, please. The appellant has sought to alter the expected build out rates for a number of sites. So, and I think that's as a result of your own assessment of local sites, Mr. Austin-Fell. So could you just talk me through how comprehensive that assessment has been and how reliable it is?
Happy to, sir. So you're quite right. Appendix A of my proof sets out a sample of sites that follow schemes consented or delivering since the plan was adopted in 2015. We sought to use that as a line in the sand to demonstrate what has happened, particularly sort of after the recovery from recession, but also principally aligning with the adoption date of the core strategy. So we have a number of sites in here. The sample that we've used captures just shy of 10 sites, but they are sites of different range and size. And we are reliant really on the sample that can be achieved from schemes in East Cambridgeshire. The outcome of that assessment indicates to us that the median build-out rate is around 33 dwellings per annum. And that's 33 dwellings per annum when looking across the range of sites that, as I said, issue between about 50 and indeed 650 dwellings here. And what we've sought to do here, sir, is to apply that rate on a number of sites where we challenge the council's rates of delivery that have been either generated themselves or relied upon through correspondence with developers, agents, etc.
Right, okay, so we're looking at Appendix A of your evidence. There's 8 sites there. How have you selected those sites, please?
Those sites have been selected through an interrogation of the council's completions register. And we've looked at, I understand, a sample of all of those large schemes above 50 units that have come forward. It's as comprehensive, I think, as we can make it. I think, as I said previously, we are reliant on the information that we have. And whilst there are a number of schemes currently in operation, we don't have a wealth of samples that we can rely upon. What I would point out anecdotally as well, sir, is that one document which you'll often see surfacing at examination or inquiry is the Lichfield start to finish document, which undertook a national exhibit of developments looking at both lead-in times and build-out rates. The sample for that document has widened as the consultancy has undertaken various iterations of it. But if I recall rightly, I don't think the sample for the first iteration, which was widely lauded and used at examination, was very different to the sample of the 8 dwellings that we've seen. I think they only had about 12, 13 sites in there. And again, that was seen to be a sort of credible approach, often used and supported.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Kay, then, could you tell me how the council has approached its assessment of build-out rates and why I should prefer that to the appellant method?
Yes, thank you. I have a number of concerns with the appellant's approach, but I'll come on to that second. Our approach in our 5-year land supply report has broadly been on the basis of what is a reasonable and realistic approach within the context of a district of East Cambridgeshire. What we have coming forward is a relatively, certainly for East Cambridge context, a number of slightly larger sites than perhaps have been delivering in the past few years. And therefore, and on larger sites, we expect delivery to be slightly higher than perhaps would be the case on smaller sites. In addition to that, we've taken into account what we believe the market can both deliver, absorb, etc., again, within the East Cambridge context. And recognizing that, house prices have increased in the local area as well, which can be a driver for supply to come much faster. We haven't gone as far as an extreme of, for example, for a major city where delivery rates on a major site can be well into the several hundreds. We're not claiming anything like that kind of measure. So we've come to the judgment, partly based on recent delivery on some of the big sites, that 50, on occasion, slightly more than 50 per annum for the very big sites is a realistic prospect that can be delivered on the sites. And actually, I think the numbers provided in the appendix that you've just been discussing, Appendix A of the appellant's proof, actually backs up what we're doing rather than the contrary of what the appellant's suggesting. So could I take a little moment now to go through that appendix and raise a number of issues that we have?
Yes, but before you do that, can I just just understand exactly what you're saying? You've reached a realistic judgment, in your words, about 50 units being the right figure. Where does that come from? Can you point me to some data in evidence about past delivery that supports that?
As I said, the appellant's appendix is one of the easiest places to look at because even that demonstrates in a number of years where delivery is at or around or above 50.
Okay.
So that's part of the evidence. It's also partly from the returns we receive from the developers from the developer survey, where they themselves provide a trajectory, or we have estimated it and asked them, do you agree? And they confirm that they do agree the trajectory. So some of the trajectories is on their basis as well. Now, as I said, though, it's actually quite hard to use recent last few years data because we don't have a large sample, as the point actually Cameron Ostenfeld just made. There isn't a wealth of examples, I think was his phrase, particularly in terms of the larger sites that are now coming on stream with outline, with full permission, and are starting to be built out. And I think there's probably a general acceptance that larger sites can deliver larger volumes as a matter of principle, within reason. So it is a judgment. I mean, nobody can foresee the future for certain. The delivery rates of 50 may well be exceeded. But I think it's a reasonable prospect using the MPPF definition as well about what's realistic and reasonable. We believe 50, and occasions slightly more than 50 is reasonable. On some sites, we've gone less than 50, where we believe that's more appropriate.
Okay, just talk me through then, Mr. Ostenfeld's Appendix A, and tell me where that supports a build-out rate of 50 dwellings.
Well, there's a number of points on this appendix, and that will certainly answer the question you've just raised here. I think some of the samples he's given here are completely unfair. So I'll take row 8, for example, the last row, where this is a site of only 50 in totality. It's got permission for 50. To claim, to use that in evidence against much larger sites that are incapable of delivering 50 is simply inappropriate. I mean, for example, that site, as the Appendix A says, in 2017-18 delivered 26. Well, it's impossible for that site to deliver more than 24 in any year thereafter. But the appellant is trying to use that as evidence to claim that our average delivery is 17, which is clearly nonsensical to do that because the site can only deliver 50 in its totality. It can't deliver 50, 50, 50 every year because it's only got consent for 50. So that row shouldn't be in the evidence base at all, in my view.
Kay, I just asked what data the council is relying on, and you suggested that this was it, really.
So where there are rows here, there are rows. There are 4 rows in this evidence where the sites are in excess of 100 units, where the permission is in excess of 100 units. So if we just concentrate on those, they are rows 2, 3, 4, and 7. As you can see, the total dwellings permitted for those sites are 199, 200, 650, and 126. So they're all in excess of 100, where I think a reasonable comparison could be made for similar sort of sites. Now, if you take each of those sites, the first one, you can see 37, 37. So actually that's not delivered 50 yet, but it's not too far off. The second one, it's only had 1 year of delivery, it's delivered 51. So that's actually exceeded 50. The third one of those sites last year in this appendix, it delivered 65. So clearly it's capable of delivering more than 50. Go down to the last site, so the land west of Cherry Tree Hill, you can see there 1 year, it also exceeded 50. There's a 55 in there. So what this clearly demonstrates, on 3 out of 4 sites, they are capable of delivering in excess of 50. The fourth site was close to, and maybe as it carries on to be built out, maybe it will exceed 50. So what that demonstrates is even on this evidence, delivering in excess of 50 is clearly possible per annum, because 3 out of 4 have already achieved it. And a fourth one was very close. So I don't think it is unreasonable for the council to apply a reasonable prospect, the MPPF definition, make sure I get my phraseology precisely right, realistic prospect. I think there's a realistic prospect that sites can achieve 50 per annum because we've got evidence that they do.
Right, okay. I mean, are you suggesting to me that this Appendix A, if we look at the average dwellings per year, there's one site that achieves 51, isn't there? Are you suggesting this is the data the council's relying on to suggest that 50 should be used for other sites?
No, I'm not suggesting you should rely. I'm suggesting you should rely on 4 of those rows. For example, as I pointed out at the start, row 8, you should not be relying on, because that site only has 50 dwellings in totality, and thereby virtually impossible to deliver well, it can't deliver in excess of 50 because it only has 50 units permitted.
I understand that, but even the 4 rows that you've highlighted don't support using a figure of 50 on a consistent basis, do they?
I think they point that there is realistic prospect, because these are sites which demonstrate that it is capable of delivering 50 per annum. They may not have delivered 50 in each and every year, but the test is there a realistic prospect? And I believe, yes, there is. So the appellant is averaging it all down using all 8 rows to a 33. I think that is an unreasonable reduction in rates. I don't think that is sound evidence to illustrate what a realistic prospect is. I think that's an unreasonable reduction in figures. I still contend that 50 is reasonable and is realistic.
I'll ask Mr. Ostenfeld to respond in just a moment, but can I just be absolutely clear that the council's case for its expected build-out rates is based upon an assessment of the data from the appellant in Appendix A and the responses from developers from the 5-year housing and supply report?
It is based on the developers' survey results, but it wasn't based on this appellant's proof in the first instance, because clearly my trajectories were published before this proof was published. So this helps to illustrate the sort of evidence we were using and that we've tested through a number of publications of the 5-year land supply report. So what we do, we make a judgment as to, for each site, whether it has first of all, has it got a realistic prospect of delivering, yes or no? If yes, it goes in the 5-year land supply. We then make a judgment on trajectory. First of all, we judge on what year do we think it's a realistic prospect of starting to deliver. And we start that as year, whether it's year 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, we start the trajectory from that point. And then we make a judgment, what is a reasonable prospect for that site in terms of the number of units per year that we think that can build out. There are all sorts of judgments that go into that sort of numbers. Partly it's past delivery, it's partly the site context, and if there's any constraints on the site, for example, partly informed by what the developers are telling us that they can deliver. So I accept there's no science, it's not an absolute science behind this. It has to be a judgment, but we think the numbers are realistic and reasonable that we've put into our trajectory. And on a vast number, I think, of our trajectories, we're not actually being challenged on it. So the appellant in this case is accepting of them. But where where they are being challenged and where the appellant seems to be just approaching it as a blanket, every site should be reduced to 33 or thereabouts. They're using this appendix to justify that point. And I don't agree that this appendix demonstrates the evidence that we should be applying a blanket 33 across the board on all major sites. I don't think this evidence shows that, and I don't think my evidence in the 5-year land supply report that we've published and our judgment that we've applied demonstrates that should be the case. I'm entirely comfortable that the judgment reached that 50 is an appropriate one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Austen-Fell, can you tell me what your thoughts are on that?
Thank you, sir. Just to point out, the information that's derived in Appendix A is we use as the starting point for the planning judgment that is taken forward. It's an evidential approach to help us understand likely rates of delivery looking back at the last few years. I don't accept Mr. Kay's point that the sample should be disaggregated. That's the whole point of looking at a sample. You look at large and small sites, and we've capped that at 50 dwellings per annum as a reasonable understanding of factors which affect major schemes. And I think that's a reasonable approach to take. You're looking at an average across those, but then we temper our views on that depending on each particular site that comes in. For example, there is one site I know of where we've applied rates of 37 dwellings per annum, because that's consistent with what we've observed elsewhere. So we're not applying it in a rudimentary way. And I think it's important for us to look at all of these sites in aggregate. If we were to take Mr. Kay's view and take the bottom site off, which was the small site he referred to, around 50 dwellings, it would only have the effect of skewing the data even further. The fact remains, because the council has supplied us with this information, is that the rates of delivery that we can see here are what has come forward. The 26 in 2017, the 11, the 13 the year after. We're not seeking to say 17 dwellings per annum across the board of the schemes of this scale. We're probably applying a higher rate, which is consistent with our own evidence. The only thing I'd perhaps come back to at this stage here, sir, is this understanding of realistic prospect and what we can expect from the council in terms of the provision of evidence, because since the let's call it the significance of the Woodpit Lane decision, we have a now clearer understanding about what councils need to provide and the onus or the burden of responsibility on the council to ensure that it is their evidence underpinning the assessment for each of these sites. Just want to make a note of, sir, there's a very helpful paragraph from Inspector Stevens as part of the Cadwell Lane decision. That's core document 4.45 and paragraph 56 in particular. Now, Harold Stevens there is reflecting on Woodpit Lane, but he's cutting to the quick. He's telling us really what can constitute clear evidence. And he's telling us that it needs to be more than just a email exchange between landowners and the council. It needs to be a reasoned judgment, taking on board factors that might include deliverability, viability, etc., about when sites are going to come forward. And that is, unfortunately, the burden of the council to provide that information. And on many of the sites that we'll come to look at, that evidence, or that bar of evidence, has not been fulfilled. The other point I perhaps just make now about delivery rates is what I can't see from the council, or on very limited occasions, is who they expect to see delivering these sites out, because that's important. The council hasn't made any or very limited distinction about the type of applications in front of them, whether that's sites promoted by landowners, whether that's promoted by strategic promoters, or whether that's house builders themselves, because that makes a difference. That has a difference in terms of how quick a site can come to deliver. And similarly, it doesn't appear that there is an assessment provided on many sites in terms of how many outlets there will be on each of those sites. Because if you would treat that as a multiplying effect, so it's perhaps more reasonable to assume where there's multiple outlets on site, you might see more delivery. But what we don't have from the council is that an appreciation of that nuance. And perhaps the other harder nuance to sort of feed into the assessment of the delivery rates is our understanding of market absorption, something that perhaps has come to the fore even more following the Letwin review, and how we understand sites to interact with each other. Most notably so, I think that is a factor which will affect delivery of urban extensions around the north of Ely, as we look to see a convergence of applications which will come on board at the same time. And again, this is perhaps a more detailed nuance, which means you've got to look at the supply and the round, not just on an individual basis. And again, so that's something that I've yet to see presented by the council.
Okay, thank you. Anything further, Mr. Kay, on any of that?
Just two final points. I want to also pick up on row 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of the appendix. I appreciate this is actually a site below 100, 87 units, and you'll see in year 1 that completed 74. So clearly there was only 13 units left to deliver. So it's impossible from year 2 onwards that it could deliver anything other than 13. But then the appellant averages that out to claim that that site's only delivered 29 per year. But it's an impossibility that it couldn't have delivered any more than that, because in year 1 it delivered 74. It had no sites left. This just undermines the credibility of this evidence, in my view. The final point is, it was just quickly mentioned there, and I was going to leave this for when we actually get into the specific sites, but Mr. Ostenfeld just referred to this clear evidence test. It's just flagging up, and I'm sure we'll come back to this in later. The clear evidence test is different between category A and category B in the MPPF definitions, as I'm sure you're aware. But just to remind everyone, for those sites under category A, it's got to be clear evidence that homes will not be delivered, whereas category B, where it's clear evidence that housing completions will begin. It's a very different definition of the clear evidence test, but I'm sure we'll come on to that when we start discussing category A and category B sites. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Right, okay, talking about the clear evidence test, can I just check where it is that the onus is on the council to provide clear evidence? Is the council's evidence that attached to the 5-year housing land supply report and the responses from developers?
Yeah, so for the category B sites, our evidence is as contained in, or primary evidence is as contained in the 5-year land supply report. That's core document 3.24. Within that document, you'll see the full trajectory for each site, whether minor or major, expanding, for the full 5 years and beyond. There's then a column at the far right for each site, which I think it's headed comments or something like that. Yeah, comments, which gives a description for that site. Clearly, for the minor sites, where there's several hundred of them, we haven't stipulated a comment. But for the major sites, I think without exception, there is some commentary on why we've just given more evidence behind what that site is, what its consent position is, or whether there's a reserved matter in, or whatever it might be. Some further evidence there. And then towards the end of the 5-year land supply report, where we've had responses from the developer survey, we've included that as well to help further justify as appropriate. So that's our primary evidence. Clearly, there is other evidence as contained within our proofs, etc., where there's been a challenge for some of the sites, but we'll come on to that separately. But yes, we don't have a separate evidence report we publish each year other than our 5-year land supply report. It's all in there.
Right, okay, and you refer to the comments section, and there seems to be a summary of what the developer has said to the council.
That's correct.
The actual documents, the actual exchanges are not in evidence, are they?
At the appendix, I think it's C and D, we give a little further commentary on where we have had, Appendix D. We give a little bit more of a breakdown of that commentary, a little bit more detail of that commentary, where we've had a reply. Yep. Whereas
the council's summary of what's been said, though. You haven't included the actual responses from developers, the full versions.
We haven't submitted the actual headed paper or something like that. We've just put in the final column in Appendix D the specific comments that those developers have come back to us. They're often very, very short. How it works is we set out an explanatory letter. We put in what our draft trajectory is for their particular site, and ask them, do you have any comments, evidence, or otherwise to suggest whether these are accurate or not, as the case may be. And we compile the replies accordingly, as you can see. And a number of developers don't reply, and we despite chasing, we just have to accept that we can't compel them to reply, and a number of them don't. But where they do, we include it in the 5-year land supply report.
Yes. How reliable is it, do you think, for the council to suggest what they think is going to happen, and then rely on the agreement that comes back from a developer as evidence?
I think it's useful evidence. We don't necessarily rely on it in its entirety. There are actually a small number of instances where a developer comes back and we think, I think they're overdoing it there. They're suggesting that they're going to be on site and delivering, maybe in year 1, and we think, I'm not sure that that's convincing, and we actually push back their trajectory. But on the whole, if they are either agreeing with our draft or they adjust it slightly, then we tend to go with what the developer suggests if it looks a reasonable position that they're taking. And as confirmed by the Secretary of State decision I've already referred to, so that's core document 5.46, that pro forma approach, the Secretary of State agrees in paragraph 12 that in principle that can provide the clear evidence of a site's deliverability. So it's not, we're not doing something here which is not accepted in principle by the Secretary of State in meeting the tests he's set in the MPPF.
Thank you. Austin Fell, then, do you want to respond on any of those points?
No, thank you, sir. Only to sort of confirm what Mr. Kay has said. We have an exposition of the evidence for each of those sites in the trajectory. He's rightly confirmed that the council have focused on the major sites, which in the main makes sense, other than perhaps 1 or 2 omissions we've found. Appendix D does have that exchange, or appears to be an exchange between the council and various developers. What I would say in respect of that is we only have sort of 16 entries for the 2021 submission. So, there've been updates to some sites, but there's a number of instances where the supplier relies on developer surveys back from 2020 and sometimes before then. In some instances, there's reference made to rates which have been confirmed through the local plan process in 2018. So in my mind, I think we just need to sort of look at that evidence base, in terms of its particular vintage on a site-by-site basis. And as the council has mentioned, there's a need not to take it simply at face value. We need to be critical about the information we receive and not simply, accept it as it comes in. So that, we can perhaps discuss that in the context of the supply when we get into it.
Right, okay, thank you. Okay, it was suggested by the council in opening that it's a very marginal case now as to whether there's a 5-year housing land supply or not, based on the agreement between the parties. If one of my judgments does alter the balance, it was suggested perhaps windfall or something which might suggests that a 5-year housing land supply does exist. Is it material, do you think, the level of housing land supply, or the fact that the council has a 5-year housing land supply, is that sufficient?
I'm going to defer to the wheel warrior.
Spinning back in on my swivel chair, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. It is relevant. Whilst on the one hand, you can never get enough, and so irrespective of what the level of housing supply is, it plainly would be a significant benefit. The degree of significance plainly depends upon the amount. What I'd suggest is, in a sense, just as the Hallam judgment tells us that if you're below 5 years, the extent of the shortfall is of relevance, logically it follows similarly that the extent above 5 years, if the position you find is that it is above, is of relevance to weight too. So yes, we do suggest it is relevant to each finding, and let's be very clear about it. Irrespective of whether you think it's above or below 5 years, our position is that the council is very significantly overstating its amount of housing land supply, and is placing false confidence in its own position. And to make that point good, even if we are in an above 5 year situation, it does require interrogation of the figures rather than saying it's above 5 years. We don't need to consider it any further than that.
Right, okay. I was just checking you were still with us, Mr. Bannon.
No, absolutely. Yes, thanks for the wait. Absolutely.
All right, thank you. Mr. Kay, anything you want to say about that?
So could I?
Yes.
Could I have a
please.
pop? So the council disagrees. You'll know, sir, that national policy sets a minimum requirement of what needs to be achieved, expressed as a 5 year supply. And if you, for example, favour the council's point on windfall, and as a result, our supply is 5.04 for the sake of argument, the council then passes that test, and it's not necessary for the court, for you, sir, to go on to deal with all the other points to decide exactly what the level of oversupply is. If that were the position, it would draw the inquiry process into a protracted process of deciding exactly how much a council is passing that particular yardstick. So I say that you aren't required, and national policy doesn't require you to do so.
Right, okay, thank you. Right, okay, I think as far as points of principle go, that's probably everything. Is there anything else that either of you want to raise before we look at individual sites? Yes, Mr. Ostenfeld.
Thank you, sir. I won't keep us long on this one. Just two points to make. The first one being on the buffer, because it's the buffer that's to be applied to the requirement, which hinges on the results of the housing delivery test. Now, it's quite a binary sort of exercise. This should be plainly simple, but I think it's just worth kind of considering that in the context of what we're saying here. We've agreed that the council should apply a 5% buffer. That is perhaps different than the council have experienced in the past. When the 2019 HDT came out, I think their result was 66%. It has now jumped to 87%, so they are in 5% buffer territory. What I just paused to sort of talk about here is the significance of that jump tells us that the HDT can be a bit of a volatile mechanism. And we will come to see the latest output of the HDT covering the year 2021, likely next month. So it might land during the course of the appeal proceedings before you've written the report, sir. We don't yet know what the outcome of that result will be. I think it would be worth just perhaps allowing us to reflect on it. The inputs, let's say, to the calculation are already known. So on the basis of last year's completions, you can look at the last 3 years worth of growth versus the last 3 years worth of requirement. Unadjusted, that would put the council in a position of around 79%, so it would be a 20% buffer territory. Now, just to be clear, I'm not suggesting that is going to be the case, because I'll temper that by saying we have heard from Christopher Pincher, the housing minister, that there's likely to be some adjustment to that mechanism. which will reduce the requirement for last year. He's currently suggesting about 4 years to account for growth, slippages in growth delivery associated with COVID, which would put the council at 91%, so back where they are. But we don't yet know exactly what he's going to say. So just on that point alone, I think I'll leave it there, other than to say that this is perhaps coming around the corner, and it's just something we want to assure ourselves we know the answer to. My only sort of final point before we get on to supply is just talking about delivery again, because I just wanted to very quickly reflect on past delivery and what we can expect to see in Soham within the planning period, because it's relevant in the context of this appeal. Now, as I indicated in my assessment, we expect the council's own data to be a shortfall of around 303 dwellings by the end of the plan period, a figure which can't be made. But that itself, sir, is a policy blind position. That is simply looking at all the supply versus all of the requirement. But if you were to look at it at a more local level, for example, taking Soham, the numbers would be different again. And just as a very sort of crude exercise, if you look at table 3.2 of the local plan, there are figures in there linked to policy growth 4, which sets out a requirement for Soham up until 2031 of 2,290 dwellings. Now, so there's to date been 722 completions in Soham up to the period 2021. And if you add what the council are expecting from supply, and this is data taken from their own sources, it would see an additional 1,261 dwellings over the plan period. So adding together what's happened with what the council expect, we'd be looking at 1,983 dwellings. So 307, or around 300, let's say, lower than that 2,290 in the local plan. That's just on the basis of the information the council submitted. If so, you would rely on the figures that we suggest, the reduced rates of supply, which we can come on to. That figure is 494, so closer to 500. So I just wanted to kind of close on that one, and now we can start going through the sites at your leisure. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Kay, anything further from you?
Just 2 points. First of all, coming back on that point just made, I'm not. There was a phrase there that said that the local plan has a requirement, was the word used, a requirement for Soham. There is no such policy in the local plan that sets a requirement figure for housing in Soham. Yes, there are tables, etc., which indicate what is expected or for it, but I think the phrase requirement for Soham was pushing it too far. So I don't want you to be left with the view that the plan in some way sets a specific numerical requirement for Soham to deliver a certain number of homes. It simply sets an expectation. The second point, and this is just a very minor, I suppose, procedural point, if you like. Can I just highlight to you, if you're not already aware, before we dive into the sites, that in this statement of common ground on 5-year land supply, there is a site listed in there. So we're looking at the statement of common ground on 5-year land supply. It's just a flag up. One of the sites in that list there is no longer being disputed by the appellant. So it's just, I don't know whether you just want to kind of put a line through it, if you like. So it's page 10 of the statement of common ground, and it's the first row in that document. That site, so it's the site 230062, land parcel east of To the Shade Soham. There was 18 units disputed in that site. That site was not included in the appellant's proof, so effectively they withdrawn from that as a disputed site. It doesn't affect the numbers that we've talked about in terms of shortfall to 5, because that's all accounted for in the proof already. So, but it's just a flag up to you if you go back to the statement of common ground and you wonder where that site's gone. That's the answer. I'm sure if I've got any of that wrong, Mr. Austin-Fell will correct me, but I believe that is an accurate just update, if you like, on that particular site. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. You're in agreement with that, Mr. Austin-Fell?
Thank you, and I'm grateful for that, Mr. Kay. It is also in the schedule as part of the updated sites in front of you, which we've identified, should not be in the list, but it's right to point it out before we dive in to the supply. Thanks.
Right, okay, thank you. All right, well, we've been going for a while, so it's probably time to have a short break before we do anything else. We did have a slightly shorter morning this morning, so I think we could perhaps deal with a bit more today, if the parties are both content with that. If we adjourned until 3:30 and then sat for about another hour, any problems with that? Okay, fine. Well, we'll do that then and adjourn now until 3:30, please. Right, okay, welcome back everybody. The inquiry is resumed. We're going to move on now to have a look at some of the individual sites which are in dispute between the parties, using the list that was provided this morning. So that's starting with the category A sites. And for those category A sites, the site should be considered deliverable unless there's clear evidence to show otherwise. So that's the basis on which we're looking at these. So what I want to do is work our way through them one by one, and I'll ask the appellant to tell me why you don't think the site's deliverable, and the council to just tell me their view. The first couple on the list, there has been some agreement further to discussions between the parties. So I don't think there's any need for us to look at the sites where there is now agreement. Mr. Kay, your hand's up. Did you want to say something?
Yes, sorry, just before we dive in, sir, just thought it might be helpful just to update you where we are with the global figure in terms of the quantity of years supply which each party is now at, as a consequence of this paper that you've just started to discuss. So I've just done the quick calculations. So the council's position now, rather than the 7.04 years, with the concessions as a result of this paper to date, it drops slightly to 6.97 years supply. That's what we are now suggesting is deliverable. And the appellant's position increases slightly. It now raises up to 4.95 years supply. So I just wanted to update you where each party is with those before we dive into the specific sites. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ostenfeld, I don't know whether you've had a chance to make that calculation yourself. Are you in agreement with those figures?
Slight difference, 4.94, which is a difference in, as I see it, 40 dwellings. But as I said, in the interest of transparency, I'm happy to share my scribbles on a paper, so to speak, with Mr. Kay, and I'm sure we can do so in the coming sort of few days once we sort of have to resolve the situation between us.
Yes, okay. Well, there may be some further changes that result from our discussions. So there can be a revised figure after that, and I'll ask for a written version of that, which shows the calculation that you've each made. All right, so if everybody has got the schedule in front of them, the first site that's in dispute is 70001. So if Mr. Ostenfeld, if you can tell me what the issue is there from your perspective.
Thank you, sir. So this is a small site for 5 dwellings with detailed consent. Our principal concerns over this site is that this comes without the benefit of any particular evidence from the council. We've heard that on the small sites they generally don't have them. And put simply, sir, I'm just not convinced that this site will come forward in the next 5 years. 3 of the 5 dwellings have been already delivered, so there's 2 remaining. But you'll note that this holds with it a planning application reference back from 1986. So it's a particularly old site. It's been on the council's books for a long time. I expect it's one that the owner is now has consented, so it's at his own leisure as to when he wants to complete that, and will do so on an ad hoc basis. But there's nothing before me to tell me that this could be next year, 5 years' time, 10 years' time. So whilst I wouldn't normally dispute the credibility of something like this, it's simply the age of the application, how long it's been with the council, that causes me concern.
Okay, Mr. Kay, could I have your comments on that one, please?
Yeah, first of all, let's remind ourselves this is a category A site, as are the rest of these minor ones that we're going to talk through on page 1 and 2, of which MPPF reminds us that this is all sites with detailed planning permission should be considered deliverable until permission expires, unless there is clear evidence that homes will not be delivered. It's just a reminder that that's the definition we're talking about now for this one and the next few sites. So in terms of clear evidence, so Mr. Austin-Feld just stated that he's not convinced there is evidence that this site will be delivered. Well, the onus is on there being no evidence that there is evidence supplied that this site will not be delivered. In this case, clearly the site has commenced. I appreciate it's a very long-standing site. Dwellings have been completed. Some of the dwellings haven't. It's clearly a deliverable site. It has consent. In our view, it meets the category A test quite comfortably. And that's as much I wish to say on this one. Thank you.
Right, okay. So the appellant suggested the two remaining dwellings haven't come forward since the permission in 1986. It's unlikely they'll come forward now. What do you say about that?
Well, the test is whether it's deliverable or not, and it clearly is deliverable because it's got a consent that can be delivered. It's got a full permission to be delivered, so the council couldn't stop it being delivered if it wanted to. Therefore, whilst I appreciate that the length of time, it's not that we have to demonstrate that this site will definitely be delivered. That's not what the test is. It's a test of whether it will be, whether there is evidence to suggest it definitely will not. And I don't believe there is such evidence, because it could be commenced implementation tomorrow. It may well have even commenced already, as far as I know. As at the base date, it hadn't. But there's nothing stopping it being delivered. So it meets the category A test.
Right, okay, thank you. Okay, let's move on then to 100008. Mr. Austin-Feld, if you go first.
Yeah, sorry, that's thank you. So in respect of this application, so we have outlined scheme for a proposed dwelling and garage. There's only a few of these single units, so hopefully once we get past these, we can march on to the ones of substance. The single dwelling and garage outline scheme, the application for reserved matters should have been with the council by the 23rd of August 2020, as set out in the statement here. So from our perspective, that permission has lapsed. The council draw reference to a new application that's come forward, again, on this same site. And this is a full application, but this application, sir, has come forward on the 11th of June 2021. So in my view, so these two applications are not linked. They are separate. The application the council is relying on should be removed, and the new application should be considered as part of the next 5-year land supply update.
Right, okay, thank you. And Mr. Kelly?
Okay, again, look at NPPF definition of deliverable, opening sentence. So before it gets onto the A and B category, it says to be considered deliverable, sites for housing should be available now, offer a suitable location for development now, and be achievable with a realistic prospect that housing will be delivered on the site within 5 years. So this particular site, clearly there has been consent in the past, so it's clearly been identified as a deliverable site in the past. At the point we came to updating our 5-year land supply report, the site was whilst the previous consent may well have lapsed, it was clearly still an identified deliverable site, and that was demonstrated by permission being in place just a couple of months after the end of that base date. So this is not the same as a completely new site being thrown into the mix that has no history, that's not previously been identified as a deliverable site, etc., etc. This is a site that's been previously identified as a deliverable site. Yes, one permission may have lapsed on that site, but a new one is now in place and was going through the system at the point of the base date. So we still think this is a deliverable the clear evidence of that this is a deliverable site.
So, Mr. Kay, did this site have planning permission at the base date?
At the base date, no. So it wouldn't. No. In short, it had a consent that had lapsed at that point, but we were aware at that point of a application in the system, which was then approved a couple of months later.
Yeah. So is this a Category A site or not?
At the base date, no, that wasn't a Category A site. It's a minor site. So let me just check the definition of so Category A sites which do not involve major development and have planning permission. So it would not fall under that, strictly speaking. No, I mean it will be for the next 5-year land supply, obviously, but report that we published, but not at the base date. No. But it was a known deliverable site.
When you say it was a known deliverable site?
Because it had a very recent outline, a very recent permission that had lapsed with a new application in the system at the base date. So it was clearly a live site to the local planning authority that we know that development could take place on that site. So to take the first line of deliverable in the definition, we knew it was an available site. We knew it was a suitable location because it had a very recent permission on it. We knew with the new permission coming through, the new application coming through, that there was realistic prospect. So it's not like it's, as I said, it's not a completely brand new site to the local planning authority that we shoehorned in after the base date. That's not the case in this case. So there are plenty of other permissions that have happened since the 1st of April that we do not include in this supply at all because they're completely brand new sites, but we don't count those. This one is slightly different in that it's had a very recent permission, and therefore we consider that it qualifies under the definition.
Right. Anything further you want to say on that one, Ms. Frostenfeld?
Not really, sir. It's lapsed at the base date. It just needs to be considered as part of the next year's supply. Likely to be inclined to agree with Mr. Kay that when it's considered next year, it will be a Category A and considered deliverable.
Right, thank you. Moving on then to 130036.
Thank you, sir. This is an outline scheme, another for detached house and garage. Our evidence indicates that the site lapsed on the 3rd of August this year, and there's no further evidence to suggest that it will be coming forward, so it will not form part of the council's forward supply. The view of the council, if I'm to interject here, is that it was extended the 1st of April on the base date, but as we've discussed, there is a need to consider evidence beyond that base date period, and that is exactly what we've done. We've looked at this site and whether it can still form part of the supply. We say it does not.
Mr. Kay.
This seems a very straightforward one to me, that as at the base date, there was an extant permission. On the 2nd of April, they could have started construction on site. I actually don't know whether they have or they haven't, because as I said earlier, we don't go around monitoring sites every day, because clearly that's an enormous task should we need to do so. So whether it has or it hasn't lapsed, I actually don't know. The appellant doesn't know, because provide no evidence of a photograph on site, for example, to say, look, they haven't started on site. So actually neither party knows whether this has lapsed or not. Therefore, the the requirement under the MPPF category A, it clearly is a category A because at the base date it had consent, and there has to be compelling evidence that it's not going to be delivered. Well, we don't have that evidence. So in my mind, this is very clearly appropriate to include in the supply. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so 160036 then, please.
Thank you. So you'll start to sort of notice a bit of a pattern here because there are a few instances where we're suggesting that sites should be removed because we observe that they have lapsed, and the council will tell you that the base date is an important point. So we're just turning back to that last site, the 130036. Well, certainly we know that that hasn't commenced because that was only an outline scheme. The detail was the trigger that has afforded it its lapse, so that certainly hasn't come forward. If I just then take you on to the next one, the 160036, so it's a prior notification application for 3 dwellings. Our evidence here says that this should have been discharged by the 21st of September this year. So we again are using that time before the submission of proofs to understand whether there's been any meaningful change in whether there's a realistic prospect of a site going forward. In this instance, we say that it has lapsed and there's been no evidence to the contrary supplied by the council.
Mr. Kay?
Repeat what I said for the previous one. Whether it has or it hasn't lapsed, that's a matter we would pick up at the next monitoring cycle. At the base date, it had an extant permission, and therefore reasonable for it to be included. Thank you.
And Mr. Ostenfeld, do we know whether any development has commenced on that site? Do you know?
Not that I'm aware of, sir. And this is a site where the council's records hold that it is classified as not started. So I think we have had a number of instances on the page that we just referred to where the council's been able to provide building control records to indicate progress on site. Where that's been the case, we've duly accepted it, albeit we can't look at the building control system to confirm it. So, you know, I simply have no evidence to sort of say that this is coming forward.
If I could just jump in on the building controls issue, that is, we can use that as a source of evidence where it's our own inspectors. The problem is that not all sites use local authority inspectors. Where they are private inspectors, they don't always submit their information on a particularly timely manner. It can be several months or so. So that's why not in all instances can we check whether the building control records to determine in year whether they've started or not. That's why there can be some discrepancies.
Thank you. All right, 180051 then, please.
Thank you. So Water Tower, Grange Lane. Our evidence observes that this site lapsed on the 21st of December 2020. So this would have been removed from the supply prior to the base date. The council suggests that there's a new fresh application which was consented in August 2021 after the base date, which again sort of provides a linked expression of deliverability. We do not share that view because these are separate outline applications. They are not linked. The one has fallen away. The next can be considered in the round as part of the next supply statement.
Mr. Kay?
Yep, this is very similar to the earlier site 100008. Similar point. it's a known deliverable site. It's not a completely new site that's come in the system. I accept at the base date, the first consent would have lapsed, but we were aware of the new outline coming in, which was approved shortly after the base date. So it's a known deliverable site. So the same point of argument as previously. That's our rationale for including that site.
Okay, 230124.
Thank you, sir. This site we consider lapsed on the 23rd of August this year. Consequently, should be removed from the supply. Thank you.
Mr. Kay.
Same arguments as before. Permission was extant at the base date. Nothing further to add.
Okay, 260011.
Thank you, sir. Slightly different position here, so we've got a bit of variety. This is a site where we have evidence from the council indicating that the outline consent, well, there's a fresh outline consent which would now supersede that in this entry. So the application 19-01584 is now the subject of a new application which consented beyond the base date. So whilst we're not saying that this site has lapsed, it's our observation that the outline consent as expressed in the statement will not be delivered. It is the new outline site which has been submitted after the base date, which will come forward if the council see it so. So our position, sir, is that the entry in the council's records will not deliver, therefore it should be removed. And again, sir, the new outline that the council is proposing is something for a later time to consider.
Mr. Kay.
Yeah, I'm particularly struggling on this one, in that there's an acceptance that there's a consent in place at the base date. But for what the appellant seems to be suggesting is the fact that a further consent for that site is come forward, that it somehow removes the site. It's almost like to have two consents is equal to naught, which I'm struggling with as a concept, if I'm honest. So yes, we have a consent in place that wasn't lapsed at the base date. We have a fresh consent in place shortly after the base date. In my mind, that further demonstrates, not negates, that this site is clearly a deliverable site. So I have nothing further to add than that.
Can you offer any more clarification on that, Mr. Ostenfeld? If it had permission at the base date and it's got a further permission now, what's the problem?
I think, sir, it's all about going back to the MPPF and understanding what we have to consider about the realistic prospect of the consent coming forward. Now, what the council currently has banked, let's say before the base date, may well have been a site that could come forward. It hasn't got a detail, it hasn't got a reserved matters, I might point out. This is only for an outline. So we would have had to interrogate the legitimacy of that coming forward in the 5-year period. But the fact remains that this expression in a new application means that the entry in the council's records is not going to come forward. That will lapse, and they're going to rely on the new outline application, which has come forward after the base date. So again, so it's just a matter of fidelity of records and ensuring that we are consistent with the 1st of April.
There's nothing to stop either of those outline consents from proceeding, is there, Mr. Ostenfeld? Could reserved matters still be submitted on either or?
Until it lapses, so yes, I agree that both could see a further application coming forward. But as I mentioned, there's yet to be an expression of that detailed scheme before us. Therefore, it makes it difficult to indicate when it will be delivered.
Okay, remembering the definition that we're looking at here, and that it should be included as deliverable unless there's clear evidence that it won't be. Do you say that there is clear evidence that it won't?
Well, I think in this instance, we're looking at a category B site, so it's where it has outline planning permission, which is perhaps slightly different than that with detail, where it is a bit more explicit. So on this particular site, it shouldn't be considered deliverable where there's clear evidence that completions will come forward within the 5 years. So I remain unconvinced of which scheme will be taken forward and which scheme will actually see the reserved matters submitted on. My view at the moment is that the existing scheme isn't going to be carried forward or lapse. I think that the most recent outline will probably be the one which will continue on to some level of certainty, but that falls outside the base date.
Why do you say this is a category B site, Mr. Ostenfeld? It's a site which doesn't involve major development and has planning permission, isn't it?
Apologies, so yeah, it is fall below the 10 dwelling threshold that we usually use that as a nominal expression. But as I mentioned before, it still does not have that evidence of a detailed submission that's going to come forward. It is very, very close to that 10 dwelling threshold. And
that isn't the test, is it, Mr. Ostenfeld?
No.
Should be considered deliverable unless there's clear evidence that it isn't. So it should, the onus is on the appellant here to say what clear evidence is that this won't be deliverable.
Thank you, sir. I agree. And I think the point that I'm making or trying to make is that we have a slight irregularity here in that we have, 2 outline consents before us. It isn't the case that one is simply going to be taken forward and delivered. We simply don't know the applicant's position in which one is going to be developed. To me, it seems that the outline will lapse, albeit I can't say that for certainty yet because it's still within its period. But it looks as though the most recent one outside the base date is the one that's going to be taken forward. So it's just more about the irregularity of the permissions in front of us.
Right, okay, thank you. Let's move on to the next one then, please. 290011.
Thank you, sir. Comments similar to those we've discussed before. As a site for 6 dwellings, we say that the site should have seen a reserved matters application by the 25th of September this year, and we can't find evidence of that. We say the site has elapsed.
But had permission at the base date.
Had permission at the base date, correct.
Mr. Kay?
Yep, as before, permission at the base dates, therefore category A, therefore should be included. Nothing further to add, thank you.
Okay, 50028, please.
Thank you. This is a detailed application for a change of use for a touring park to 91 mobile homes, presumably to be occupied on a permanent basis. We observe that the application is still live, and we observe that from the information the council has provided to us, that there has been sort of some commencement on site. The council expects 64 dwellings to come forward from this site. We have indicated that there won't be any delivery on that site. The reason being, sir, is that this is a somewhat, I won't use the word exceptional, but it's a very different type of site than the rest of the supply that we're talking about. So this is a mobile home site as opposed to a bricks and mortar site. And I would be minded to consider the evidence that the applicant themselves have presented as part of the developer survey, evidence which I've replicated in my response here in the box in front of you, whereby it's been observed that park homes are slower to sell than bricks and mortar. There's been an added complication that park home manufacturers have supply issues following increased orders following COVID. So what we see here, sir, is that the consent has been discharged. We see some initial infrastructure works, which presumably are there to keep the consent alive. But there is considerable uncertainty about when the actual park home units themselves will form part of the supply. At present, I'm unconvinced that the issues that are referred to here will be resolved in the near future. And as a consequence, I've suggested it be removed in totality until we see any movement from the applicant that the circumstances or the change of circumstances have becoming more favourable.
So, Mr. Ostenfeld, are you aware that any of these units have been delivered to date, or is it simply some infrastructure work that have been undertaken?
Just the infrastructure, as far as I can see, and Mr. Kay has helpfully pointed me towards some up-to-date Google imagery, which does indicate that some initial roadworks and earthworks have been put in place, but we can't observe any units yet.
Okay, Mr. Kay.
Okay, first off, just to remind ourselves, we're still on category A definition sites here. So it's clear evidence of not being delivered, that it won't be delivered, is the test we've got to pass here. So we have a site here. It's actually for 91 units in total. The council's actually only allowed for 64 in the period. That actually reflects, in this instance, because of the special circumstances of what's been delivered and what the manager of the site said about delivery can be slow. So we haven't applied a 30 or 40 or whatever units per year delivery rate on this site. We've capped it at 18. And therefore that's, we've actually even acknowledged that point that the group manager said about it not necessarily being quick to implement. But what's the clear evidence that Mr. Ostenfeld seems to be presenting to you that this site isn't deliverable is that he's just got considerable uncertainty and he's unconvinced, were his two phrases. What we have actually is on site within 3 or 4 months of year one commencing of the 5-year period, we've got quite considerable groundworks taking place on site. The road layout is now clearly visible. I agree that I'm not aware that actual units have been put on that site yet in year one, and our trajectory doesn't claim there will be any sites delivered in year one. We're stipulating naught. But what I am suggesting our trajectory is that next year, so that's from April 2022 to April 2023, we're allowing for 10 units to come forward. I think with a site that's delivering, under construction now, under construction from summer 2021, it is reasonable that come 2022, 2023, units can start to be delivered on site. I fail to understand how this site can be deemed as a flat undeliverable without any units whatsoever on this site. We haven't got any clear evidence presented to that effect. In my mind, it's a very clear category A MPPF definition. Arguably, we've been a little bit pessimistic because we could have argued that the full 91 could have taken place on site, particularly as we've now got evidence that it's actually under construction in year one. But I'm not going to put that to you, sir. I'm happy to stick to the the 64 that we've set out in our October report, that's maybe something we pick up in next year's supply to increase that. But I'm very confident that this should be included in our 5-year land supply. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, 100030 then, please.
Thank you, sir. This is land north of Cambridge Drive, Ely. Reserve matters already in. This is an application which was consented in August 2020. In short, we're not disputing the deliverability of this site, but what we are disputing is the rates of delivery that can be expected from it. So as what we've done is we've observed rates of delivery which have taken place in 2018-19 and 2019-20 on the site, rates of 37 dwellings per annum. And rather than use the 50 dwellings per annum indicated by the council, we've applied rates that have been observed here. So slightly different than our sort of usual 33, we've uplifted that to 37. What we've also done is made an adjustment to the lead-in time. So as opposed to seeing delivery from year 2, this year, we're assuming 2023. So in short, rather than the 258 in the council supply figure, we are suggesting 89, which is the 37 over the 2-year period.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Kay?
Just before I go into it, I've actually just spotted a slight error in that table, in that we're not suggesting in our 5-year land supply that it would be 258, it is 200. The remaining 58 we've got in year 6. I don't think that affects the numbers in any way. I think that's just a typo on that table that you've got in front of you. So once again, category A site. This one, we've listed it down as not delivering in the current year we sit now, so that's year 1, but commencing delivering year 2. We think that's a reasonable position to take for a category A site. We've had a discussion earlier about what the trajectory rate should be. We've gone for 50 on that site as a reasonable judgment rather than 37. The applicant acknowledges this is a deliverable site. The difference between us is when will the site start and what rate will it deliver? And the decision for the decision maker, it depends on whether you've got compelling evidence that what we've suggested is realistic is not realistic. We believe it is a category A, and we believe we've come up with a reasonable trajectory for delivering that site. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Austin Fell has looked at the past delivery on this site and come up with a figure of 37 DPA. What is your opinion on that? Why should I not rely on that figure?
I think there's a danger of relying on a single, well, it's only 2 years of delivery, where I from recollection, that this has delivered 37 and 37 for 2 years running. As for this is a very, very large site. Ely North of combined is about 3,000 units. I think elsewhere within Ely North, of which this is just a small part, we have seen delivery beyond 37 units. I think it's not unreasonable that this site could deliver 50 units. So there's not a huge difference between the two of us on this particular site. He's simply using what it did when the site first started delivering 37 units. I believe it's not unreasonable. There is a realistic prospect that it could deliver a little bit more than that, and we've seen evidence of that elsewhere in that very locality. It's a judgment matter at the end of the day. What I don't think is, it is equally a judgment matter, but what I certainly don't in any way concede is that should be year 3 only onwards. I certainly see this it being reasonable to suggest that this can be delivered from year 2.
And Mr. Ostenfeld, why do you say this won't deliver until year 3?
I've just looked at build out rates as I envisage them like to happen. So we're already, with the benefit of actually the first year taking place, we're now in the second year of trajectory almost. So it's a reflection of likely development times that will be needed, the lead-in time that will be needed to see those first units on site. What I haven't done here is I haven't sort of included a lower rate for that first part of it. I've just concentrated with the 37 dwellings per annum for years 3 to 5. Just a further comment. So this is the first of 3 schemes that are consented in this particular locale. And when we're looking at delivery rates more generally, it's to consider those perhaps together, as I mentioned before, looking at the consequences of competition between sites and market absorption.
Right, so this site has a reserve matters approval in place. I'm sorry, I'm trying to understand why you say it won't deliver until year 3. I'm not quite understanding why you say that.
Again, I haven't seen any evidence that there's work underway that sort of demonstrates to me that those units are going to come forward in the next financial year. So sorry, the next monitoring year, so the 2022-23. If Mr. K on the council through their evidence had indicated there were spades in the ground and we could start to see some units there, my position might be changed. But as it stands, I'm using lead-in time between sort of 15 and 18 months to see that first completion, reflecting the size of the site and the level of pre-commencement conditions needed to be discharged.
Thank you. Mr. Kay, has there been any progress with discharging conditions that you're aware of?
To answer that directly, I don't know. But the onus here is that Mr. Ostenfeld has just said there that he hasn't seen any evidence, quote unquote. Well, this is a category A site. The onus is on the appellant to demonstrate that there is evidence that it won't deliver in line with what the council's suggesting. And he's to throw back at us to say that he hasn't seen that evidence. Well, that's not what the definition says. That's not the test. If the appellant should be demonstrating that. Now, at the base date, this had a reserve matters approval. So therefore, it had 2 years lead in to start mobilizing on site in order to start construction and get things going within the second year and actually start delivering. So I don't think that's an unreasonable position to take for a category A site. And I'm not hearing any evidence from the appellant otherwise to the contrary, other than that they've not seen any evidence that is going to be the case. Well, that's not what the test is, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Will the parties, there was the error that's been identified for between 258 and 200. Will the parties just check that hasn't been carried into the calculation when you come to provide your revised figures, please? Okay, 120019, please.
Thank you, sir. This is a smallish site, land between 3 and 5 New Road, Haddon. This benefits from a full consent, category A. Now, what we observe here, sir, is that the full consent, which was provided by the council in March 2019, was for 16 dwellings. Now, what we also observe is there is a more recent consent granted on this site for 24 dwellings approved on the 30th of June. And we're kind of coming back onto sort of similar territories before, sir, but the point that we're putting to you is that there's a clear demonstration by that particular applicant to pursue a different scheme. This 2019 scheme for 16 dwellings has clearly got more to squeeze out of it, hence the new application for 24. And whilst we accept that it is still live, it has not lapsed, we see that this new scheme, which falls beyond the base date, is the more likely scheme to be carried forward, and that 2019 proposal is likely to be unimplementable.
Mr. Kay.
Yes, like the previous one, I find this one a struggle to get my head around. So we have two permissions in place. Neither have lapsed. Both are category A, I believe, definitions, but it's almost by virtue of having two, we end up with naught. Seems to be the appellant's approach on this site, which I struggle to understand. We haven't attempted to upgrade the numbers to 24 as a result of the new permission. We've stuck with the original 16. Come next April, we will be updating it to 24, but that's for another year. But the mere fact that a new application's come in just reinforces, in my view, that the site is deliverable. And the appellant is just providing no evidence for a category A site, providing no evidence that that's not the case. So I'm really struggling with this one, I'm afraid. And I believe the council, including this one in its supply, is entirely justified. Thank you.
Thank you. One 13001 then.
Thank you, sir. Detailed application for 14 dwellings. We say that this site should be removed from the supply entirety. It lapsed on the 9th of September 2019. The council observed there's a new application that's been submitted, albeit it's a outline application this time for 17 dwellings, which was granted consent 24th of June 2021. So this was quite clearly lapsed before the base date. There's a new application in post the base date, but it shouldn't form part of the supply.
Mr. Kay.
Yeah, I accept, and this one is at the base date. This is, I believe, not a category A site because I think the permission had lapsed and the new one that wasn't in place. It's one of those, going back to the previous discussions on some of the couple of the minor sites, is it's a known deliverable site. It's had its consent. We knew there was a refresh application coming in, and therefore, subsequently determined shortly after the base date whether it should be here in the hierarchy of the sites or should be lower down the hierarchy of the sites. That's a debatable point, I accept. But in terms of, is it a deliverable site? Yes, it is. And we've got evidence here of a previous consent at the base date that it was clearly a deliverable site because we had a known application recently, and we had an application in for the site, and then shortly after the site was granted permission, and therefore reconfirms that what we believed already, that it was a deliverable site. But I accept it's one of those where it's where in the hierarchy do you put it? It could be here or it could be lower down, but it's still a deliverable site.
Right, okay, so it didn't have a planning permission at the base date, but the council was aware that there was a planning application submitted at that time.
That's correct. Plus, because ordinarily, if it was just that, we wouldn't include it, because we wouldn't include an application on a non-allocated site, for example, or without any other history. That would be something that would be picked up in future years. But this site is slightly different in that it's not only the application was in, but it was a site that was very recently had a permission on site, so it was a known deliverable site. Hence why it was included in the why it's included in the supply.
Right, okay. And you said this isn't a category A site. Obviously, this is a major development, being more than 10 dwellings. So clear evidence is required in this case, isn't it, that the site is deliverable?
I think in this case, yes, because the new permission is also an outline as well. So it's the evidence is whether does the fact that this site has a recent permission and a new application in, which was subsequently determined shortly after the base date, does that constitute the clear evidence test? That's a matter for the decision maker. I would say yes, it does, but I accept this is one where a judgment can be made. It's not as black and white as perhaps some of the others we've discussed so far.
Right, okay, moving on, 230050.
So I think this is one we are now in agreement.
Sorry, yes, quite right.
No, that's fine. It was helpful. I think it's useful to understand the council helpfully provided me that information. We were able to agree it. If you don't mind, do you mind if I speak very briefly on 230060, which is Blackberry Lane? This is perhaps one of the ones where we've managed to get purchased between the two of us, and I've observed that the construction of a sales office, or the promise of a sales office by the 22nd of this month, has given me greater confidence now that delivery can be brought forward and that there would be sort of certainty in year 2, and consequently the council have also considered an adjustment to the delivery rates consistent with what we have been proposing. So a position has been agreed between ourselves where we've confirmed rather than the 160 or the 84, as I think that position should be, not 76. It's 117 from this site.
Thank you. 230062 then.
Thank you. So this is land east of the Shade in Soham. So this has consent at the moment, sort of full consent from 2016. What I note here is that the council are considering 49 dwellings from this scheme in the trajectory, currently regarded to be not started if I look at the data that they provided to me. This consent was sort of granted back in 2018 and subsequently lapsed on the 9th of August this year. So no further work had commenced and been taken forward. The council's evidence sort of refers to a partially superseded application from 2019, which it is aligned with the term of the base date, but I'm not wholly convinced that that links satisfactorily to the scheme that is in front of us under this this reference. If I can just alight on that one a little bit, the council have made reference to application 19-00771/FUM. If we look at that record entry, so in the council's planning records, this is an entry for the provision of a 70-bedroom care home and 18 dwellings. So it's significantly different from the proposal consented back in 2018.
Right, okay, Mr. Kay.
Yeah, slightly complicated, this one. So what you have is as you can see in that table, if you go to the fifth column, the original permission is for 88 units. So that's what's got it's a full application for 88 units. So it has it's a category A site we're referring to here. Now, what happened subsequently was a separate application came in which overlapped this site, but also extended onto some other land adjacent to it. So you've got these two permissions, as I understand it, that are, in terms of physical on the ground, they overlap. They don't completely sit on top of each other. So it's not a completely new permission that sits on top of the same land, but the two sites overlap. Now, when the consent for the second application came in and was approved, what was clear with the application and what was clear in the officer's report when it was taken to members on this site is that the bit of land on the first application that was not overlapped could still be delivered. And so that was recognized that the first permission could be partially implemented, even if the second permission was implemented in full itself. So what you were left with is the 49 units that we are suggesting in the 5-year land supply can still be delivered as a result of the first permission, even if the second permission then goes ahead. So that the two permissions could be delivered, albeit if the second permission is delivered in full, the first one couldn't because of that overlapping. So what we're not claiming is a full 88, as you can see from the supply, because of this overlapping consent. Now, the appellant has accepted some delivery, because it's not in your table here, because they've accepted delivery from the other consent, but they're not accepting the original permission that at their base date, that permission was still extant and the 49 units could still be delivered. Now, whether they will or not, that's a matter for future 5-year land supply updates of whether that first permission ultimately lapses or not. We don't know. At the base date, it was extant, it was a category A site. There's no clear evidence that 49 will not be delivered. So that is why it's included in the 5-year land supply report, and I think it's perfectly reasonable to do so. I hope that explanation was, you understood that overlapping issue, because it is a slightly complicated site, this one.
Yes, I think so. Thank you, Mr. Kay. Mr. Ostenfeld, anything more you want to say on that?
No, I mean, yeah, it's quite a complicated one. Grateful to Mr. Kay. Let's keep it with my simple point then, so that this scheme should have been discharged by the 9th of August this year. So again, it comes down to a base date issue about whether it should be included or not in the supply.
Right, I said we'd sit for about an hour. I think there's one site left that's been identified in the category A group. So let's deal with that one, and then we'll finish for today and deal with the category B sites tomorrow. So the final one, 230062. Oh, hang on a minute. Is that?
You'd be grateful to say that one has been included erroneously. So we haven't disputed this one. It's just made its way into the report.
Right, okay. It has the same reference as the previous one, but I can just delete that row entirely, can I?
It does, yes. Have you still got the appetite for one more, or would you like to draw a line?
No, I don't. I think we'll stop there if that's the case. Mr. Kay, you're in agreement that that row can be deleted.
Yeah, the reason, as I explained earlier, the reason why it's there is because it is in the statement of common ground that it is a disputed site, but it's no longer disputed after that had been published. So that's why it's in there. So yes, you can just strike a line through it. It's not a relevant one now.
Right. Okay. We'll stop there, and we can all look forward to doing the rest tomorrow. Are there any other matters that anybody wants to raise before we adjourn?
Just one, sir, I forgot to mention this morning, but in case it helps you plan ahead, or Mr. Smythe, I think my estimate for cross-examination of Ms. Greengrass was an overestimate on reflection. I think it's more likely to be an hour to an hour and a half. That may or may not assist you to know now, but in case it does, I'll let you know now.
Yes, that's helpful. Thank you.
So in that spirit, I can't remember what my estimate of cross-examination was, but I don't think I'll be more than an hour with Mr. Hill.
Thank you.
Yes, okay. You'd previously said an hour and a half. So
Yeah, I think it'll be, yeah.
Thank you. Right, good. Well, that's fine. We're still on track. That helps the timetables. So good. We'll finish for today then, and adjourn until 9:30 tomorrow, please.
See you then.
Okay. Thanks very much.
See you.